Wells family marked what would have been the teen's 19th birthday today with a national day of prayer. The Mississippi teen went missing after going out on a boat trip with friends on the 4th of July. His body was recovered 2 days later, and his cause of death remains unknown. Joining us now are Nolan's parents, Christine Wells Wansley and Elmore Wansley. They're joined by family attorney Ben Crump. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Christine, give us a sense of what the hardest part of today is.
Not having him here, not being able to FaceTime him and sing my horrible happy birthday song. Yeah, it's just him not being here with us.
Elmore, how are you remembering your son on this day? Not so much for how he died, because we still don't know that, but for how he lived.
Just the joy that he brought to our family. Just watching old videos and just reading old messages. Just memories of conversations, of wrestling matches, me chasing them around the house, stuff like that. That really helps with the entire situation. Thinking about the good times.
Why was it important for you all to do these vigils and honor Nolan in this way on his birthday?
To make sure that his story stays alive, for people to understand too that it's okay to want to ask questions, want to make sure that you know the truth of what happened, but most importantly, just keeping his legacy alive.
Any idea how Nolan would have celebrated his 19th birthday?
He would have been at school, so
Yes.
of course we would not have been able to see him until the weekend. So I'm sure he would have gone to football practice, had class, and probably been like, "Hey, Ma, hey, Dad, send me some money so I can go get some actual food."
Yes.
Ben, want to bring you in here. So where do things stand now in the investigation?
Well, right now we're still seeking answers. I know we're trying to work collaboratively with the district attorney's office. Obviously, the Congressional Black Caucus has asked for the FBI to open an investigation. But, we're celebrating Nolan's birthday, what would have been his 19th birthday. Over a month has passed since his tragic death, and still we don't have the answers to what happened to Nolan Wells.
You've criticized the local authorities' handling of the case, emphasizing the need for transparency. The Jackson County District Attorney released a statement yesterday following public criticism of the DA's office and an investigation of the case, saying in part, public commentary does not make the speaker transparent, just like exercising restraint consistent with the law does not make the process corrupt. The fact that something is said does not necessarily mean it's actually true. What's your response to that?
Well, we've never criticized the district attorney's office. We obviously share with Nolan's parents and his family the question, will we get a full, fair, and transparent investigation in the death of Nolan Wells? Obviously, people are concerned all across America. Can we get a full, fair, transparent investigation? Isn't that what everybody would want if this was their child, to know that their child life is going to be treated as important as any other person's life? And that's what we're fighting for.
Ben, you've mentioned the importance of federal resources. Have you received that?
We haven't gotten an answer to that yet.
Christine and Elmore, what has the community response been like?
So far it's been very positive. We are so grateful for our community. A lot of people are, showing us a lot of love, especially when we're out in public. So for those of you who are standing behind us, beside us, in support of us, I just want to say thank you to everyone.
Do the police regularly give you updates?
Well, we've been working. I'll say that we've been engaging with the district attorney's office, and I will say this, Lindsay, that we are still on his birthday asking for the public to continue to share with us photographs, videos, and any kind of things they witnessed out there. We are still trying to get to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We want to know what happened to Nolan Wells. Wouldn't that be a great birthday present if people came forward and said, I'm going to tell what I saw? Because we always have said from day one, somebody knows something, somebody saw something.
And Christine and Elmore, have you heard from any of the young men who your son was out with that day?
We won't get into that.
Okay, understood. Okay, last question. How would you like for people to remember Nolan?
As a big ball of sunshine.
Yeah.
That
Fun. He's
yeah.
a very fun person.
That just
Full of laughter.
wanted everyone to feel loved, feel included, and most importantly, you know, a peacemaker. He was not someone who got behind, you know, bullying, you know, those types of behaviors. That wasn't Nolan. That's not how we raised him to be.
Ben Crump, Christine, and Elmore Wansley.
On what would have been Nolan Wells' 19th birthday, his family gathered for a national day of prayer, remembering a son they described not by the mystery surrounding his death, but by the joy he brought into their lives. In the interview, Christine and Elmore Wansley spoke about the ordinary moments they now miss most, FaceTiming Nolan, singing to him, watching old videos, reading messages, and remembering the wrestling matches and laughter that filled their home. But beneath those memories is a question that still has no clear answer. What happened to Nolan after the 4th of July boat trip to Horn Island? His body was recovered 2 days after he went missing, while the circumstances of his death remained unresolved. Attorney Ben Crump said the family was still pursuing a full, fair, and transparent investigation. He said the Congressional Black Caucus had asked for federal involvement, while the family continued asking the public to share photographs, videos, or anything they personally witnessed that day. Crump returned to the appeal the family has made from the beginning. Somebody may know something. Yet when asked whether they had heard from the young men who were with Nolan that day, his parents declined to discuss it. For Christine and Elmore, the focus remains simple. They want Nolan remembered as a bright, joyful peacemaker who made people feel loved and included. And until the unanswered questions are resolved, they believe his story must stay alive today too.
Not having him here, not being able to FaceTime him and sing my horrible happy birthday song. Just him not being here with us.
Elmore, how are you remembering your son on this day? Not so much for how he died, because we still don't know that, but for how he lived.
Just the joy that he brought to our family. Just watching old videos and just reading old messages. Just memories of conversations, of wrestling matches, me chasing them around the house.
For Nolan Wells' parents, the hardest part of his 19th birthday was not simply remembering the day he was born. It was facing the reality that he was no longer there to celebrate it with them. Christine Wansley described the small tradition she could no longer have with her son, calling him, seeing his face on FaceTime, and singing him a birthday song. Elmore Wansley chose to remember Nolan differently. Rather than focusing on the unanswered question of how his son died, he focused on how Nolan lived. He remembered the ordinary moments that now carry enormous weight: old videos, messages, conversations, and memories of wrestling matches at home. Those memories reveal why this loss is about more than an unresolved investigation. For Nolan's family, every unanswered question exists alongside a lifetime of moments they know were real. They are holding on to the person Nolan was while still waiting to understand what happened to him. Those memories remain with them as they seek answers.
Nolan Wells, it gets worse for District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath. Yesterday, I did a post on this as a former person who had her position as the district attorney, indicating that she needed to give basic information. For example, what was the agreement with this phone? You just can't let the family have one point of view and you not get out there because you're saying that your ethics rules prevent you from speaking about the case. Hold on. I don't know. Maybe she was watching the video because I said she was leaving a big void and having the public argue over things, and that she should get out there and let us know without compromising the investigation. And what does she do? She doubles down yesterday and makes a statement that she would, quote, be stepping outside of the bounds of the law if I were to fill that void, use the very same word, and share information publicly, end quote. Hold on. She said it would violate her oath and she wasn't going to do that. Now, that is not accurate. And so, just so that we can be clear, given the fact that usually these rules are pretty similar from state to state, and I did this, I didn't say you have to reveal any investigative information from the grand jury whatsoever. Quite the opposite. Go to my other videos or my long form video that I'll do here on YouTube and you could check out. I agree. Keep those proceedings secret. That's the way they're meant to be. But, DA, you forced me to go look at Mississippi ethics rules so that we could properly educate the public. And this is Mississippi Rule 13:5, persons authorized to present during grand jury secrecy. And I'm going to put it a little up here. Let's read along here. No attorney general, district attorney, which is what you are, county attorney, they have other people, shall announce to any unauthorized person, listen carefully, DA, what the grand jury will consider in its deliberations. If such information is disclosed, it's a violation of the order. What they're going to talk about in their deliberations. Hold on. So nothing prevents you from, as we can see here, talking about what the agreement about the phones was. Did you make an agreement or didn't you make the agreement? You can't let the family just have it one way. Otherwise, what they're saying, I'm going to accept as being the truth unless you state otherwise. Number two, they want to know, why aren't all the body parts sent to the independent medical examiner? Now, I understand why based on investigation, but you need to inform and educate the public. That does not get into the deliberations of the grand jury whatsoever. It's common sense, basic stuff that's done each and every day. What are the time frames that are going to happen here, and what can we expect? And also, what about the hours of work, the number of witnesses interviewed, things done generally in the investigation? None of that, district attorney, violates the rule that says, and I'll read it again, discussing things that the grand jury will consider in its deliberations. You're just talking about what happened in the investigation. Like, share and follow for more.
So it is being said now that the Mississippi DA is looking at the Nolan Xavier Wells case as a criminal investigation now and not just an accidental drowning case. Now, this is big news, guys. This is a very, very positive update, because we didn't just want this to be accepted as that. We need to look at all stones, you know what I'm saying, and not let any stone be unturned. And that is what also the parents wanted. This is a good thing, so that way we can investigate all different scenarios, and all possibilities can be examined. Okay. So this is great news. Let's not get too excited just yet. We don't know every detail yet. Ben Crump has not announced this as of yet. There may be a reason, but let's just sit and wait on this, and time will definitely tell. I feel like this may be true for sure, considering the fact that the NAACP has just joined the case of Nolan Wells alongside Ben Crump and Al Sharpton, and considering the fact that the FBI has stepped in. I feel that this may be truth, okay? If you like content that I post and you want to see more from me, hit the follow button. I appreciate each and every one of you. Let's continue to say his name, Nolan Xavier Wells. Let's figure out until we get all the information, you know, Let's see what the verdict is after everything is looked at properly. That's all we wanted, okay?
The pressure on Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath is now shifting to a question that goes beyond the investigation itself. What can the public reasonably expect to be told while this case remains active? In this interview, a former prosecutor challenges the idea that grand jury secrecy automatically prevents the DA's office from explaining basic investigative matters. His argument is not that prosecutors should reveal confidential grand jury testimony or disclose what jurors are considering. Instead, he says there is an important distinction between protecting secret proceedings and refusing to clarify ordinary questions surrounding the investigation. And one of the biggest questions he raises involves Nolan Wells' phone. The Wells family and the district attorney's office had agreed to a joint forensic examination of the phone, an issue that has become increasingly important because the device could potentially contain information relevant to the timeline and communications surrounding Nolan's disappearance. According to the commentator, the public deserves to know what that agreement actually was, what each side agreed to, and where that process currently stands. That does not necessarily mean investigators should reveal the contents of the phone. It means the existence and basic terms of an investigative agreement can be discussed without exposing grand jury deliberations. That distinction is at the center of his criticism. He makes a similar argument about the medical evidence. Questions have been raised publicly about why certain portions of Nolan's remains were not available for the independent examination. The commentator says explaining the general reason for that decision would not necessarily reveal anything about what a grand jury is considering. In his view, the public can be given procedural context without being given confidential evidence. But there is an important caveat here. His interpretation of Mississippi's rules is his legal opinion. It should not be treated as a definitive ruling that the district attorney has violated any law or ethical rule. The DA's office has maintained that its ability to speak publicly is limited while the investigation is ongoing. And that brings this argument back to the larger issue, the information gap. When officials say little, families, journalists, and members of the public are left trying to understand what is happening from whatever information is available. That can create competing narratives, especially in a case where major questions remain unresolved. The commentator's position is essentially that transparency does not have to mean revealing everything. It can mean explaining what can be explained, the general investigative timeline, the status of evidence, the existence of agreements, and what the public should realistically expect next. For the Wells family, those answers may not solve the central mystery of how Nolan died. But they could provide something else the family has repeatedly asked for, a clearer understanding of what is happening behind the scenes. And until the investigation reaches the grand jury, the distinction between secrecy and silence may become one of the most important issues surrounding this case. Because this remains an active investigation, the safest conclusion is not to assume what the silence means. The information shows disagreement over how much can be explained, not proof of wrongdoing. Questions still remain, and now, another development is raising the stakes in the Nolan Wells case. According to this update, the investigation in Mississippi is reportedly being treated as a criminal investigation rather than simply an accidental drowning case. That distinction is important because an accidental death and a potential criminal investigation lead investigators to examine very different possibilities. But there is a major reason to be careful with this information. At the time of this discussion, the speaker acknowledges that the development had not yet been publicly announced by Ben Crump, who represents Nolan's family. In other words, this was being presented as an emerging report, not as a fully confirmed announcement from the family's legal team. And that uncertainty matters. The basic argument being made is that Nolan's death should not be prematurely placed into a single category before every reasonable possibility has been examined. The family has repeatedly called for a thorough investigation, and this reported shift would mean investigators are looking more broadly at the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death. That does not mean a crime has been established. It does not mean a suspect has been identified. And it certainly does not tell us what ultimately happened to Nolan. It simply means that if the report is accurate, investigators may be approaching the case with a wider investigative lens. The timing is also notable. The speaker points to growing involvement from major civil rights organizations and public figures connected to the case. The NAACP had become involved alongside Ben Crump and Reverend Al Sharpton, while federal authorities had also become involved in aspects of the broader investigation. Those developments, according to the speaker, are part of the reason they believe the reported change in classification could be legitimate. But again, belief is not confirmation. That is an important distinction when a case is developing this quickly. Social media can turn an unconfirmed update into an established fact within minutes. Here, the speaker actually urges viewers to wait for more information and says time will reveal whether the report is accurate. And that may be the most responsible way to look at this moment. Nolan's family has never simply asked for one particular conclusion. What they have asked for is the opportunity for every possibility to be examined before anyone decides exactly what happened to their son. If investigators are now looking beyond an accidental drowning theory, that could become a significant development. But until officials formally confirm what has changed, it remains a report that needs to be treated carefully. Because the central question has not changed. What happened to Nolan Xavier Wells? And until investigators have examined all the evidence, the answer remains unresolved.
All I'm going to say is keep your eyes on that phone. Because apparently the whole state of Mississippi want to get a hold of that phone. Because we already know them boys, folks are in the higher ups in that government. So they probably know a good bit of people that want to get a hold of that phone and play in your face. So if everybody cool, I keep my eyes on it. Or got some real people you can trust to keep your eyes on that phone. Because if they all want a hold of it, it's apparently there's still something on that phone that's still going to open this wide open. They have a smoking gun. And that's what's going to give it up even more. The jig's already up, but it's going to be more oil in the fire. You just watch.
What's up, family? The district attorney in Ocean Springs, Jackson County, Mississippi, wanted Nolan Wells' cell phone. Well, now Nolan's family has essentially said, fine, you can have it. Let's examine it. And just like that, the pressure may have shifted from Nolan's family straight back to the DA. And I love it, man. I ain't got no problem with that, and here's why, family. For weeks, the phone dispute created the impression that Nolan's family was somehow preventing investigators from getting access to potentially important evidence. But the family's attorneys have maintained that they weren't refusing to have the phone examined. That's the DA right there, family. Yeah, that's her, McElrath. Yeah. That's her name, McElrath. The disagreement was over how the forensic examination would be conducted, who would participate, and how the evidence would be handled. Now, the family has reportedly agreed to a joint forensic examination and proposed a window between August 18th and August 21st to get it done. So what's the problem now? If the DA wanted the phone examined, examine the damn phone. If there's something wrong with the family's proposed protocol, explain what it is and propose an alternative. It's as simple as that, fam. It don't take a rocket scientist to schedule an appointment. See, you can't keep allowing the narrative.
And this is where the phone dispute becomes much more important than it may have appeared at first. For weeks, Nolan Wells' cell phone had been sitting at the center of a growing disagreement. To anyone following the case from the outside, it could easily look like a simple question. If the phone might contain evidence, why not just hand it over? But according to the Wells family's legal team, that was never the real disagreement. The issue was not whether Nolan's phone should be examined. The issue was how that examination would happen, who would be present, and how the data would be handled. That distinction matters, because the latest documented developments show that the family has agreed to a joint forensic examination. On August 17th, the family's attorneys said their experts were ready and asked Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath's office to select a time between August 18th and August 21st for the examination. The parties had previously agreed in July that the phone would be examined jointly. So the picture being presented online, that Nolan's family simply refused to let investigators examine his phone, does not match the position the family's attorneys have publicly described. And now, that changes the question. If both sides agree the phone should be examined, what happens next? That is where the pressure moves back toward the investigation itself. Because a forensic examination is not simply someone unlocking a phone and scrolling through messages. The goal is to preserve the integrity of the evidence, establish what data exists, determine what can be recovered, and document how the information was obtained. A joint examination also allows representatives for both sides to observe the process rather than relying on competing descriptions afterward. That is precisely why the family has wanted its own experts involved. And there is a reason the phone has received so much attention. Earlier in this investigation, questions were raised about what information remained on Nolan's device. His family said they found missing or unavailable content when they looked through parts of the phone after it was returned to them. Those concerns became one of several reasons the family pushed for an independent investigation alongside the official one. But we have to be careful here. A missing message is not automatically proof that someone deleted it. A forensic examination does not automatically produce a smoking gun. And the fact that people are interested in the phone does not prove that it contains evidence of a crime. What it can do is answer questions. What data is actually still there? What can be recovered? What is the timeline contained within the device? And can investigators establish, through forensic methods, whether the phone contains information that helps explain the final hours of Nolan's life? Those are questions that evidence can potentially answer. And this is where the latest development becomes significant. The family's attorneys have essentially said, the phone is available. Their experts are ready. The district attorney's office can choose the time. That means the debate should no longer be about whether the family is willing to allow an examination. The focus should be on getting the examination conducted properly. If there is a disagreement over the proposed protocol, then that disagreement can be explained. If investigators need a different procedure, they can propose one. If both sides already agree on the basic objective, then the remaining issue becomes how to carry it out in a way that protects the evidence and gives everyone confidence in the result. And that is especially important because this case has already produced competing narratives. One narrative suggests the phone itself may be crucial. Another says there is no reason to assume the device contains anything that changes the investigation. At this point, neither side should be treated as proven simply because it sounds convincing online. The phone needs to be examined. The evidence needs to be documented. And whatever the forensic analysis finds, or does not find, needs to be interpreted in context. Because even if the phone contains something important, it will not answer every question surrounding Nolan's death by itself. That brings us back to the other piece of this investigation that deserves attention, the boat. Before Nolan disappeared, he had been on a 4th of July trip to Horn Island with friends. His body was later found in the water near the island. The official investigation has examined the vessels connected to that trip, and records show investigators obtained GPS information from 2 boats on July 8th. That GPS information matters because unlike a social media post or an online theory, location data can help establish where a vessel actually traveled. But even GPS has limits. It can tell investigators where a boat was. It cannot automatically tell them who was on board. It cannot tell them what every person was doing. And it cannot, by itself, explain what happened to Nolan. That distinction is crucial. Because once a case becomes heavily discussed online, individual pieces of information can quickly become conclusions. A location becomes a motive. A missing message becomes proof of deletion. A strange timeline becomes proof that someone was lying. Investigators cannot work that way. They have to separate what is documented from what is alleged, and what is known from what is still unknown. The boat records give us one part of the timeline. The phone may eventually give us another. And then there are the accounts of the people who were actually there. That is where this case becomes much harder to reduce to one simple explanation. According to the public record, Nolan went to Horn Island on July 4th with friends and did not return with them. His body was found 2 days later. Authorities initially investigated the death without announcing evidence of foul play, while the family continued pressing for a broader examination of the circumstances. Now, months of questions have led to a much larger demand for transparency. And the phone is only one part of it. Because if investigators are going to reconstruct what happened, they need more than one device, more than one timeline, and more than one person's version of events. They need the pieces to line up, and right now, they don't all line up neatly. That does not mean someone committed a crime. It means there are still unanswered questions. And the most important thing investigators can do now is determine which of those questions can actually be answered by evidence. So when people say, just examine the phone, there is a legitimate point behind that. But the same standard has to apply to everything else. Examine the records. Examine the timeline. Examine the boats. Examine the digital evidence. Examine the available medical evidence. And then compare those findings against the statements of the people involved. Because the goal should not be to prove one theory. The goal should be to find out what actually happened to Nolan Wells. And that is exactly why the next phase of this investigation could matter so much. But there is another reason the phone dispute matters. It is not just about one piece of digital evidence. It is about whether the people investigating Nolan's death can establish a timeline that everyone can independently examine. Think about what a phone can potentially contain: calls, messages, photographs, location information, application activity, and other digital traces. None of those pieces automatically tells the entire story. But when they are compared with other evidence, they can help investigators determine whether different accounts of the timeline are consistent. That is why the forensic process matters so much. If the examination is done properly, the result should not depend on which side tells the better story afterward. The evidence should speak for itself. And that is also why the family's agreement to a joint examination is significant. Their position, as described publicly by their attorneys, has been that they want the phone examined under an agreed process rather than simply turning it over without safeguards. That distinction has been easy to lose in the public debate. The argument was never simply, we don't want anyone touching the phone. The argument was, if this phone is going to be examined, let's make sure the examination is transparent, properly conducted, and independently observed. Those are two very different positions. And now that the family has reportedly made the phone available for that process, attention naturally shifts toward the district attorney's office. If there is still a disagreement, what exactly is it? Is it the date? Is it the forensic protocol? Is it who will be present? Is it how the extracted data will be preserved and shared? Those questions can be answered without revealing confidential investigative information. And answering them could potentially reduce some of the speculation that has surrounded this case. Because one of the biggest problems in a case like this is the space created when confirmed information is limited. People begin filling that space themselves. A rumor becomes a possibility. A possibility becomes a theory. And eventually, the theory gets repeated so many times that people start treating it like a fact. That is something we have to avoid here. There are already claims circulating about what may have happened on the 4th of July, what may have happened after Nolan disappeared, and what evidence may or may not exist. But unless those details are supported by official records or reliable reporting, they should remain exactly what they are, claims. The same caution applies to the idea that Nolan's phone contains a decisive piece of evidence. It might not. At this point, we simply do not know. And that is why an actual forensic examination is far more valuable than thousands of people arguing about the phone online. The evidence can potentially answer questions that speculation cannot. But the phone is only one part of the larger timeline. Investigators also have to account for what happened on the water, what happened after the boats returned, what witnesses reported, what digital records show, and what the medical evidence can establish. Each piece has to be placed in sequence. That is how investigators move from uncertainty toward an evidence-based conclusion. And there is another point worth emphasizing. A criminal investigation, if that is how authorities ultimately classify or pursue the case, does not automatically mean investigators have determined that a crime occurred or that a particular person is responsible. It means investigators are examining the circumstances with that possibility in mind. That distinction is especially important for Nolan's family. They have spent months asking for answers, but answers are not the same thing as accusations. The family's position has consistently centered on wanting the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death examined thoroughly. That is why every new development should be viewed through the same standard. If evidence clears up a question, report it. If evidence creates another question, report that too. If something is unverified, say that it is unverified. And if officials have not confirmed a claim, we should not present it as fact simply because it fits a theory. Because ultimately, this case does not need a conclusion manufactured online. It needs a conclusion supported by evidence. And right now, the phone may become one of the most closely watched pieces of that evidence. Not because we know it contains a hidden answer. We don't. But because everyone now has a reason to want the same thing. For the device to be examined properly, for the results to be understood in context, and for whatever information it contains to be weighed alongside everything else investigators have collected. The same goes for the boat records. The same goes for witness accounts. The same goes for the medical evidence. And the same goes for the timeline. If those pieces eventually point in the same direction, investigators will have a much stronger foundation for determining what happened. If they contradict one another, those contradictions become questions that have to be resolved. Either way, the evidence matters more than the online narrative. And that brings us back to the question that has followed this case from the beginning. What happened to Nolan Wells after he went to Horn Island on July 4th? His family deserves an answer. But the answer has to be earned through evidence. Not assumptions. Not rumors. Not social media theories. Evidence. And as the phone examination moves closer, that may be one of the first opportunities to replace speculation with something much more concrete. Whatever investigators ultimately find, the important thing is that the process is thorough enough that the findings can withstand scrutiny. Because for Nolan's family, this is not content. It is not a debate. It is their son. And until the evidence establishes what happened, the investigation still has work to do.
Hey y'all, hey. I got this video a couple of days ago and I've been kind of like not really interested to see it, but I finally just said, what the heck? Let's listen to what he has to say. So let's listen to him.
They killed Nolan Wells on the boat. They covered him up with the life jackets. They all knew he was on the boat. They just laid him on the back of the boat and got towed in part of the way. Then they got their boat running and they got on in. And when they got in, they couldn't figure out where they were going to put him or what they were going to do. So they dropped everybody off. Then they went back out to the island that the GPS doesn't show, but they did because they disconnected it. Okay? And none of them had their phones with them when they went back. So there wasn't any trace of them going back. And they dumped the body. They came back, took the boat out of the water, then went over there at 3 a.m. and washed the boat, thinking washing the boat would get all the DNA and everything off the boat.
Now, after you've listened to it, I'm sure that you got the same thing that I have. I don't think that he's describing what happened or like if he had firsthand knowledge of what happened and things of that nature. I think what he is doing is saying that this is what he heard on one of the panel's lives or something of that nature. And he is saying that these content creators, TikTok creators, we are the best investigators out there, and that the police or investigators, or if there are any in this case, should look into the things that we have researched because he feels that we're spot on.
Well, that is a serious thing for anybody to say out loud. And before we go one step further, we need to draw a hard line between what has been alleged, what has been reported, and what investigators have actually confirmed. Because as of now, no agency has publicly confirmed that any of Nolan Wells' friends were responsible for his death. Nobody has been arrested or charged in connection with his death. The investigation remains ongoing. And the three young men most frequently named in public discussions of that 4th of July trip, Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour, have denied through their attorneys that they had anything to do with Nolan's death. Their attorneys have said the young men loved Nolan like a brother and want the truth about what happened. That matters. It matters because once a case reaches the internet, people can begin treating suspicion as proof. A question turns into an accusation. An accusation gets repeated. And eventually, a person's name can become attached to a conclusion that investigators themselves have never reached. We cannot do that here. There are unanswered questions in Nolan's case. Serious ones. Questions about the timeline. Questions about why he did not return from Horn Island with the group. Questions about what evidence exists and what investigators have been able to establish. But unanswered questions are not the same thing as proof. And if there is going to be an answer in this case, it has to come from evidence. Now, with that said, there is one part of this story that continues to stand out. While Nolan's parents have been publicly asking strangers to come forward with photographs and videos from Horn Island, the people who were with him that day were not strangers. They were there. They were part of the group that traveled to the island with Nolan on July 4th. And that is why their accounts matter. Not because being present makes someone guilty. It doesn't. But because the people who were physically there may be able to help investigators understand what happened during the hours before Nolan disappeared. According to the public timeline, Nolan traveled to Horn Island with friends to celebrate the 4th of July. He was later reported missing after the group returned to the mainland without him. Authorities have said the investigation into his death remains ongoing, while Nolan's parents have publicly disputed the idea that he would have simply chosen to stay behind by himself. That disagreement is one of the reasons this case has drawn so much attention. Nolan's father has said he does not believe his son would have voluntarily remained behind when his friends left. The friends, meanwhile, have described a different version of events, that Nolan chose to stay on the island after meeting someone and believed he had another way to get back to the mainland. Those are competing accounts of what may have happened. And investigators have to determine which details can actually be supported. That is the key. Because this cannot be decided by who tells the most emotional story. It cannot be decided by who has the most followers. And it cannot be decided by which theory becomes the most popular online. It has to be decided by evidence. What do the videos show? What do the photographs show? What does the boat data show? What do phone records show? What did witnesses actually see? And do those pieces fit together? Those questions are especially important because law enforcement itself asked members of the public to provide original, unedited photos and videos from the northwest tip of Horn Island. Investigators specifically sought material that could show Nolan alleged altercations, arguments, disturbances, or other unusual activity. That tells us something important. Authorities believed eyewitness material from that day could be relevant to understanding the timeline. And that brings us back to Nolan's parents. Imagine what that must feel like. Your son goes to an island with people who know him. He does not come home. Days later, his body is recovered. And now you are on national television asking people you have never met to search their phones for pictures or videos that might explain what happened. That does not mean Nolan's friends have withheld evidence. We do not have proof of that. But it does explain why the family continues asking for every possible photograph, video, and witness account. Because when the central question remains unanswered, even a few seconds of video can matter. A timestamp can matter. A background voice can matter. The position of a boat can matter. The time a person appears in a photograph can matter. And sometimes, evidence that looks unimportant when it is first recorded becomes important only after investigators begin comparing it with other evidence. That is why original files matter more than edited clips. A video posted online may show only a few seconds. The original file may contain metadata. It may establish when it was created. It may provide more context before or after the moment that was posted. That is one reason investigators often want the original material. Not because every video contains a secret answer, but because investigators cannot know what matters until they examine the full context. And here is where we need to be very precise about the friends. The public has every right to ask questions about what happened on Horn Island. Investigators have every right to interview people who were there. The Wells family has every right to seek answers. But asking questions is not the same as declaring someone guilty. Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour have denied involvement in Nolan's death through their attorneys. No public agency has announced criminal charges against them in connection with his death. That remains the factual line as this investigation continues. So when we ask, what have Nolan's friends been doing? The responsible question is not an accusation. It is a question about what information they may have, what they told investigators, and what evidence can confirm the events of that day. And there is another important development. Two of the friends, Warren Hudson and Jack Spatalo, later returned to Horn Island with their attorneys. Their legal representatives said the purpose was to better understand the layout and conditions of the location where Nolan disappeared. The attorneys also maintained that the young men had nothing to do with his death. That return to the island does not answer the central mystery. But it does show that the public story did not simply end when the boats came back to shore. Everyone involved has continued to face questions. Nolan's parents have continued asking for information. Their attorneys have continued pushing for answers. The friends have continued denying wrongdoing through their lawyers. And investigators have continued working the case. So before we look at what reportedly happened out there, remember this. There are things we know. Nolan went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th. He did not return to the mainland with the group. His disappearance was reported later that night. His body was found on July 6th. Investigators collected information and asked the public for photos, videos, and witness accounts. And the circumstances surrounding his death remain under investigation. Then there are things we do not know. We do not publicly know every conversation that took place on the island. We do not know exactly what Nolan was doing during every minute of his final known hours. We do not know whether every public claim about that day is accurate. And we do not have an official conclusion establishing how Nolan died. That uncertainty is frustrating. But it is also the reason we have to be careful. Because the truth in a case like this is not found by choosing a side before the evidence is complete. It is found by following the timeline, checking the records, testing the claims, and allowing facts to eliminate possibilities one by one. And now, we need to go back to Horn Island. Back to the 4th of July. Back to the people who were there. Because the next part of this story is about what has been publicly reported regarding that trip, what the friends have said happened before they left the island, and why Nolan's family says that account still leaves them with questions. Watch this. Then let's break down what we actually know about what happened out there, step by step, separating the confirmed timeline from the claims that are still being disputed.
Nolan Wells' friends are going back to the island. The three boys that were with Nolan Wells on that July 4th incident are going back to the island to investigate. Okay? That's per their attorneys. Okay? Their attorney said, we want to prove these three boys are innocent. They are going back to the island where the incident happened. Now, folks, this case has been controversy since day one. But I'm going to tell you as an investigator, everything in my being, everything of the knowledge that I gained over my 27-year career, 14 as a detective, these three boys are innocent. If they're going back to the island with their attorney and staying in the public eye, this even proves more to me that these boys are innocent and they're willing to prove their innocence. What do you all think about them, all three of them, going back to the island, as their attorney said, to investigate what happened? What do you guys think in the comments? CNN is reporting.
And this is where the story takes another turn. After weeks of public scrutiny surrounding the July 4th trip to Horn Island, two of the young men who were with Nolan Wells that day actually returned to the island with their attorneys. Their lawyers told CNN that Warren Hudson and Jack Spatalo went back to Horn Island on August 7th to examine the layout and dynamics of the place where Nolan disappeared. A third friend, Morgan Seymour, had initially been expected to return as well, but CNN reported that only Hudson and Patalo were there that afternoon. The attorneys said they spent roughly 3 hours on the island. That distinction is important because the discussion around this case has often blurred what was planned with what actually happened. The attorneys representing the 3 young men have repeatedly maintained that their clients had nothing to do with Nolan's death. They described them as completely innocent and said their focus was on finding the truth. CNN also reported that no one had been arrested or charged in connection with Nolan's death at that point. So when you hear someone say, they went back to the island to prove their innocence, we need to be precise. That was the position expressed by their attorneys. It is not the same as an official finding by investigators. And the fact that 2 of the friends returned to the island does not prove guilt or innocence by itself. What it does show is that the people defending these young men wanted the public to understand that they were willing to physically return to the location and examine the environment for themselves. Their attorneys said the purpose was not to collect evidence. They wanted to understand the island's layout and dynamics. Later reporting also emphasized that the visit was intended to help the attorneys understand the location rather than conduct a formal evidence-gathering operation. That may sound like a small distinction. It isn't, because Horn Island is not just a backdrop in this story. It is one of the central pieces of the timeline. It is where Nolan went on July 4th. It is where he was last known to have been with the group. And it is where his body was found 2 days later. So understanding the physical environment matters. How far is the beach from the areas where people gathered? Where would boats have been? How difficult would it have been for someone to leave the island? What routes could someone realistically take? What does the shoreline look like? Where are the areas that would have been crowded? And where are the places that might have been relatively isolated? Those questions do not establish what happened to Nolan, but they can help investigators and attorneys understand whether different versions of the timeline make physical sense. And that is exactly why returning to the scene can be useful. Not because the island itself is going to reveal a hidden answer, but because sometimes a map is not enough. Sometimes you need to stand in the location. You need to see the distances. You need to understand the water. You need to understand the terrain. And you need to compare those physical realities with the accounts people have provided. The attorneys for Hudson, Patalo, and Seymour have said their clients were innocent and that they were being subjected to intense public scrutiny and harassment. CNN later reported that the attorneys said the 3 young men had become targets of online threats and defamation despite cooperating with investigators. That creates a difficult situation. On one side, Nolan's family is demanding answers about how their son died. On the other, the young men who were with Nolan are publicly denying any involvement and arguing that they have been unfairly blamed for something they did not do. Both realities can exist at the same time. A family can have legitimate unanswered questions without those questions proving that the people being questioned committed a crime. And people accused online can defend themselves without that defense automatically resolving the underlying investigation. That is why the evidence matters so much. And there is still a significant amount that the public does not know. For example, we know that investigators interviewed the 3 friends. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter told the Sun-Herald that the 3 friends who traveled with Nolan were interviewed in depth. But the public does not have a complete transcript of those interviews, and we do not know every question investigators asked or every answer that was given. That means there is a huge amount of information sitting between what officials know and what the public knows. And that gap is where speculation grows. One person sees the friends returning to the island and thinks, that proves they're innocent. Someone else sees the same event and thinks, why would they need to go back? But neither conclusion is justified simply from that visit. The only thing we can responsibly say is that 2 of Nolan's friends returned to the island with their attorneys. Their lawyers said they were there to investigate the layout and dynamics, and their legal team continued to publicly maintain that the 3 men had nothing to do with Nolan's death. Everything beyond that requires evidence. And that brings us to the most important question in the entire case. What actually happened after Nolan was last seen? The public has heard different descriptions of that afternoon. The friends' attorneys have said Nolan chose to remain on the island and believed he had another way back. More recently, their attorneys told CNN that the boat they were on developed a problem, including a failing bilge pump, and that the young men were dealing with the emergency as they prepared to leave. They said Nolan had indicated he was going to remain behind and that he could find another ride. Nolan's parents have questioned that account. They have said the behavior described does not fit the son they knew. That disagreement is important, but again, it is a disagreement over what happened, not proof that one side is lying. The investigation has to determine what can be independently verified. And this is where digital evidence could become extremely important. Phone records, location information, photographs, videos, boat GPS data, witness statements. Each piece can potentially establish part of the timeline. And when those pieces are placed together, investigators may be able to determine which events are supported by independent evidence and which remain claims. That is also why the dispute over Nolan's phone has received so much attention. The family has maintained that they are willing to have the device examined, but they have wanted the forensic process to be conducted jointly and with safeguards around the evidence. The dispute has therefore not simply been about whether the phone can be examined. It has been about how that examination will happen and how the extracted data will be preserved and shared. That is a technical issue, but it has enormous consequences. Because if both sides eventually receive the same forensic extraction, then the discussion can move away from competing claims about what the phone contains. The data can be analyzed. Messages can be examined. Timestamps can be compared. Location information can potentially be evaluated. And whatever the phone does or does not show can be compared against the rest of the investigation. But we should not assume the phone contains a hidden answer. There is no verified evidence publicly establishing that. The phone may contain something important. It may contain very little. It may simply confirm portions of the existing timeline. The point is that investigators do not know until it is properly examined. And the same principle applies to the island. Going back to Horn Island does not automatically reveal what happened to Nolan, but it can help people understand the environment in which the final known events occurred. That matters because one of the central questions in this case has always been whether the circumstances surrounding Nolan's disappearance are consistent with the explanation initially considered by authorities. Early in the investigation, officials said drowning was suspected and no obvious signs of foul play had been identified. But that was not the same thing as a final determination of the cause or manner of death. The family's independent autopsy later reported that the cause and manner of death were undetermined, pending investigation. The independent pathologist also noted limitations that affected what could be concluded from the examination. The official Mississippi autopsy was still a separate matter, with its findings not initially made public. That distinction cannot be overstated. Drowning suspected is not the same as drowning proven. And no obvious foul play identified is not the same as foul play ruled out. Those are very different statements. The family has therefore continued pushing for a broader investigation. And the public conversation has grown beyond the original question of whether Nolan accidentally drowned. Now people are asking whether every reasonable possibility was fully examined before any conclusion was reached. That is a fair question to ask. But the responsible answer is not to replace one unproven theory with another. It is to examine the evidence. That is why the upcoming forensic work, the official medical findings, the digital evidence, the witness accounts, and the timeline all matter. And it is also why the friends' return to the island should be viewed carefully. Their attorneys say they went there because they wanted to understand the location and defend their client's position. Nolan's family wants answers about what happened to their son. Investigators are responsible for determining what the evidence actually shows. Those are three different roles. And confusing them is exactly how a complicated investigation can become distorted. There is one more development that raises the stakes even further. A $100,000 reward has now been offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction in Nolan's case. Reverend Al Sharpton announced a $50,000 reward during Nolan's funeral, and Tyler Perry matched it, bringing the total to $100,000. That reward changes the incentive for anyone who may possess information. It also sends a very clear message from the people supporting Nolan's family. If someone knows something relevant, they want that person to come forward. But even here, we need to be careful with the wording. A reward does not mean investigators already know that someone committed a crime. It means information is being sought that could help resolve the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death. And that information could come from a witness. It could come from a photograph. It could come from a video. It could come from a digital record. Or it could come from someone who remembers a detail they initially thought was unimportant. That is why the family's repeated request for photographs and videos matters. Nolan was on a crowded island during a major holiday. There were many people there. There were boats moving around. People were taking pictures. People were recording video. People were communicating on their phones. And somewhere inside all of that activity may be information that helps establish the timeline. But finding that information is not the same as finding a confession. Sometimes evidence is much less dramatic. A timestamp, a location, a person appearing in the background, a boat leaving at a particular time, a message that confirms where someone was. Those small details can become important when investigators compare them with other records. That is how a timeline is built. And the timeline may ultimately be more important than any single theory. Because the central mystery is not simply where Nolan was found. We already know that. The question is how he went from being alive on Horn Island to being found dead 2 days later. What happened between those points? Who saw him? Who spoke to him? Where was he? What time was he last seen? What did the boats do? What happened after the group left? And what evidence can independently confirm those answers? Those are the questions that still matter. And until investigators can answer them, nobody watching this case should pretend that the final explanation is already known. The friends say they are innocent. Their attorneys say they are innocent. No one has been arrested or charged. The family says they want a complete investigation. The independent autopsy did not establish a cause or manner of death. And officials continue to investigate. That is where the facts currently stand. Everything else needs to be tested. And that is exactly where this story gets even more interesting, because once you put the island visit, the medical evidence, the reward, the phone dispute, and the unanswered timeline together, the question is no longer simply what people believe happened. The question becomes, what can actually be proven? And that is where we need to go next. And that is where the focus has to shift from what people think happened to what the evidence can actually establish. Because there is a temptation in a case like this to take one unanswered question and build an entire theory around it. But the more responsible approach is to take every known piece of the timeline and ask the same question. Does this information support the explanation we have been given, or does it leave something that still needs to be answered? Start with the decision to return to Horn Island. Warren Hudson and Jax Pitalo went back to the island with their attorneys, while Morgan Seymour was not present during that visit. Their lawyers said the purpose was to understand the layout and dynamics of the location, not to collect evidence. CNN reported that the visit lasted about 3 hours and that the attorneys continued to maintain that the 3 young men had nothing to do with Nolan's death. That does not prove their innocence, but it also does not prove their guilt. It simply gives investigators another opportunity to compare what the young men have said about that day with the physical reality of the island. And that comparison could matter. Because when someone describes where they were standing, where Nolan was last seen, where the boats were located, and how people moved around the island, those details can potentially be tested against GPS records, photographs, videos, and witness accounts. That is how a complicated timeline becomes more concrete. And there is already one important point that has to be separated from speculation. The friends have publicly described a scenario in which Nolan chose to remain on the island after the boat developed problems. According to their account, Nolan was with a girl and believed he could get another ride back. They have also said Nolan left his phone on the boat. Those claims have been publicly challenged by Nolan's family, who have questioned why he would voluntarily stay behind without his phone or keys. That is the conflict. Not a proven conclusion. A conflict. One side says Nolan made a decision to stay. His parents say that explanation does not make sense to them. The job of an investigation is to determine whether independent evidence supports either version. And that is why the phone could become so important. If Nolan's phone can establish where he was, who he communicated with, or what activity occurred around the time he disappeared, those records could potentially confirm or challenge parts of the timeline. But again, we cannot assume what the phone will show. The device has to be examined first. And the same thing applies to the boat. Publicly released GPS data has already helped establish that the boat traveled to Horn Island and later left the island that afternoon. According to the timeline released by local reporting, the vessel arrived at Horn Island around 11:14 a.m. and left around 4:31 p.m., eventually returning to the original dock. Those are the kinds of details that matter because they create fixed points in time. If somebody says something happened at a particular moment, investigators can compare that statement against where the boat actually was. If a photograph is timestamped, it can potentially be compared with GPS information. If a phone records a location, that can potentially be compared with both. Individually, these pieces may seem small. Together, they can become a timeline. And the timeline is everything. Because the central unanswered question is not simply whether Nolan ended up in the water. The central question is how he got there, what happened before that, and whether the available evidence supports the explanation that has been publicly discussed. That is why the independent autopsy matters too. The family commissioned an independent examination, and the reported result was that Nolan's cause and manner of death were undetermined pending further investigation. Local authorities initially suspected drowning, but the independent examination did not establish drowning as a definitive cause. That does not prove homicide. It does not prove an accident. It means the medical evidence available to the family did not provide a definitive answer. And that leaves investigators with a responsibility to keep examining the circumstances rather than forcing the evidence into a conclusion before the evidence supports one. The official autopsy is another piece of that puzzle. According to reporting, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office completed the official autopsy, while the findings were not immediately made public because the case was expected to go through the grand jury process. So there are still major pieces of information the public has not seen. That is why the demand for transparency has continued. But transparency does not mean releasing every piece of evidence to the internet. There are legitimate reasons investigators protect evidence during an active investigation. What the public can reasonably ask for is clarity about the process. What has been examined? What remains outstanding? What evidence has been collected? What is the current status of the investigation? And when can the family reasonably expect answers? Those are very different questions from asking officials to reveal confidential grand jury information. And that distinction has become especially important in this case because so much of the public conversation has been driven by incomplete information. There are people online who have already decided what happened. There are people who believe the friends are innocent. There are people who believe the original drowning theory should never have been questioned. And there are people who believe foul play must have occurred. But none of those positions becomes fact simply because thousands of people repeat them. The investigation still has to do the harder work. It has to test each possibility. And that means looking at evidence that may support a theory as well as evidence that may destroy it. If the phone confirms the friend's timeline, that matters. If it contradicts part of the timeline, that matters too. If the GPS records confirm where the boat was, that matters. If witness accounts contradict one another, that matters. If the medical findings eliminate one possibility, that matters. The goal is not to find evidence that makes the story more dramatic. The goal is to find evidence that makes the story more accurate. And that is why the return to Horn Island should not be treated as some final answer. It is another event in an investigation that is still unfolding. The attorneys say their clients are innocent. The family continues to seek answers. Authorities continue to investigate. And no one has been publicly charged with Nolan's death. Those facts all need to remain in the story. At the same time, Nolan's parents should not have to spend months asking the public to search through old photographs and videos simply because the basic timeline remains unclear. If someone has original footage from that afternoon, it may be valuable. If someone remembers seeing Nolan at a specific time, that could matter. If someone captured something in the background of a photograph that they never thought was important, investigators may want to see it. And if someone knows something that could help establish the timeline, now is the time to come forward. There is also a financial incentive for information. A $100,000 reward was announced by Reverend Al Sharpton and Tyler Perry for information leading to an arrest and conviction, with each contributing $50,000. That reward is not evidence that investigators already know a crime occurred. It is an appeal for information that could help determine what happened. And that distinction is important, because if someone has information, the value is not in posting a rumor online. The value is in getting that information to investigators or the family's legal team so it can actually be evaluated. That is how this case moves forward. Not through accusations. Not through harassment. Not through threats against people connected to the case. And not through turning an unverified claim into a headline. It moves forward when evidence is preserved, witnesses speak honestly, records are examined, and investigators follow wherever the facts lead. There is one more thing I want you to remember as we close this section. The people involved in this case are not characters in a mystery. Nolan was a real person. His parents are real people grieving their son. His friends are real people facing intense public scrutiny. And the investigators are dealing with a case where every conclusion could have consequences for real lives. That is exactly why accuracy matters. We can ask difficult questions without declaring someone guilty. We can question an official explanation without inventing an alternative. And we can demand transparency without pretending we already know the answer. At this point, the strongest position is also the simplest one. Keep examining the evidence. Keep checking the timeline. Keep asking for the original photographs and videos. Keep watching the forensic examination of Nolan's phone. And wait for the official medical findings and the investigative process to establish what can actually be proven. Because the truth does not need us to manufacture it. If the evidence supports the drowning theory, then that evidence needs to be explained. If the evidence points somewhere else, investigators need to follow it. And if the evidence remains inconclusive, then that uncertainty needs to be acknowledged too. Nolan's family deserves an answer that can withstand scrutiny, not just an answer that sounds convincing on social media. So if you have been following this case, I want you to stay with the facts. Watch the developments. Look at the evidence. And most importantly, do not turn speculation into accusations against people who have not been charged. Because the goal here is not to decide who is guilty. The goal is to understand what happened to Nolan Wells. And if you believe his story deserves continued attention, do one simple thing. Keep his name in the conversation. Share this video with someone who has been following the case. Leave your thoughts below, but keep them respectful and based on what we actually know. And if new evidence comes out, we will break it down piece by piece, separating what is confirmed from what is claimed, and what is fact from what is still unanswered. Nolan Xavier Wells deserves the truth. And until that truth is established, the questions remain. Stay informed, stay respectful, and keep watching.